The last good plate was a ghost of a life that had never been. Arthur Finch held it under the water from the pump, his calloused thumbs tracing the delicate blue willows painted on the porcelain. A fine crack ran from the rim to the center, a white line of lightning in a placid sky. It was the only thing of his mother's he had left, the sole survivor of the jarring wagon ride to this unforgiving patch of Wyoming soil 5 years ago. He washed it every day, a ritual of remembering a softer world. He was waiting. The whole town of Redemption was waiting with him, though they pretended not to. From the corner of his eye, he could see Mrs. Gable sweeping her porch for the 3rd time that morning, and over at the saloon, a few idle hands were leaning against the posts, their gazes drifting down the dusty track that led east. They were placing their bets, he knew. The cruelest wager in town was how many days Arthur Finch's next bride would last. No one had ever bet on more than 7. His advertisement in the territorial newspaper had been an act of pure desperation, paid for with the last of his seed money. Homesteader seeks wife. Sober, hard-working. Modest but secure future. It was a lie, of course. His future was anything but secure. Under the Homestead Act of '62, he had to prove up his claim within the year, which meant building a permanent dwelling and cultivating the land. He had the dwelling, a dugout sod house carved into the side of a low hill, and he had the cultivation, fields of struggling corn and beans baked by the relentless summer sun. What he didn't have was a wife, a requirement seen by the land office as proof of serious intent to settle. 3 times he had tried. 3 women had come, drawn by the promise of land and a husband. The first, a seamstress from Ohio, had taken one look at the dugout, the endless brown grass, and the silence, and had begun weeping. She was on the next wagon back east 2 days later. The second, a stern widow from Illinois, had lasted 6 days. She'd tried to run his farm like a military campaign, found his quiet nature lacking, and declared him and the land a lost cause. The third had been the worst. A pretty girl from Missouri, young and full of dreams that shattered the moment she saw the reality of his life. She'd stayed just long enough to tell him he was a fool for thinking anyone would share such a miserable existence, then paid her own passage home. Each departure had been a fresh humiliation, witnessed and dissected by the town. So when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, a knot of cold dread tightened in Arthur's stomach. He dried the plate, hung it on its lonely hook on the wall, and walked outside, forcing his shoulders straight. The stagecoach was a lumbering beast, swaying and creaking as it drew closer. It pulled to a halt in front of the general store, the driver shouting greetings. A few passengers disembarked, stretching their legs. Arthur scanned their faces, looking for a woman traveling alone, a woman with hope and trepidation in her eyes. He saw no one like that. Then, the driver opened the coach door one last time and gestured inside. A figure emerged, small and hesitant. It was a woman, yes, but not the kind he or anyone else in Redemption had expected. She was Chinese, dressed in dark, simple trousers and a tunic, her black hair pulled back in a severe bun. She couldn't have been more than 21, her face smooth but her eyes ancient with caution. In her hands, she clutched a single, tightly wrapped bundle tied with twine. A silence fell over the street. Mrs. Gable's sweeping stopped. The men at the saloon straightened up. This was a new wrinkle in the sad comedy of Arthur Finch. He had sent his money to an agent in San Francisco, a man who promised a suitable match from a list of respectable women seeking husbands in the West. He had imagined someone plain, perhaps, someone sturdy and willing to work. He had not imagined this. Arthur walked toward the coach, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on his back. The woman looked at him, her gaze flicking from his worn boots to his sun-weathered face. There was no fear in her expression, only a deep, unnerving stillness. "I am Arthur Finch," he said, his voice hoarse. She gave a slight, formal bow of her head. "My." Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent street. The agent's letter had called her Lin Mai, but she had shortened it, as if offering only the smallest part of herself. Arthur paid the driver, the transaction feeling like the final seal on a terrible mistake. He loaded her small bundle onto his wagon, the lightness of it a testament to her poverty, or perhaps her practicality. He helped her up to the seat, her hand small and cool in his for a brief moment. The ride to his homestead was 5 miles of silence and rattling wood. He wanted to ask questions, to voice the confusion and anger churning inside him, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That she was the wrong race? The wrong woman? That the agent had cheated him? It was too late for any of that. She was here. When they arrived, he saw the homestead through her eyes. The dugout was little more than a cave with a wooden front, the roof thick with prairie grass. The fields were green but thirsty. The vast, empty sky pressed down on it all. It was a place of profound loneliness. He had grown used to it, but seeing it now, with her beside him, he felt a fresh wave of shame. He led her inside. The single room was dark and cool. A rough table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, a stone hearth for cooking. It was clean, meticulously so, but stark. Her eye swept over the room, missing nothing. They paused on the single blue and white plate hanging by the hearth. For the first time, her expression changed. A flicker of something, not quite recognition, but a deep and quiet understanding. She looked from the plate to him, and her gaze was so direct it felt like a physical touch. He had the sudden, unnerving feeling that she could see the crack running not just through the porcelain, but through him, too. The 7-day clock had started ticking. But as he looked at this strange, silent woman, he found himself wondering not if she would leave, but what secret she was hiding that had brought her to a place like this at all. The first 2 days passed in a strained, suffocating silence. Mai moved about the small dugout with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and unsettling. She unpacked her bundle, revealing not clothes, but a few well-made tools, a sharp trowel, a small hand rake, and a sealed clay pot. She cooked meals from his meager supplies, producing savory stews from dried beans and salted pork that tasted better than anything he'd ever made himself. She asked for nothing and said little, her hands always busy. She mended the tear in his work shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Arthur worked in the fields, the sun beating down on him, his mind a turmoil. He felt the town's judgment like a physical weight, imagining their jokes and their pity. He was a man who couldn't even secure a proper American wife and had to settle for a foreign girl who didn't speak. Except, he was beginning to suspect she could speak perfectly well. She was simply choosing not to. Her silence was a wall, and he had no idea what lay on the other side. On the 3rd day, the sky began to change. The brilliant, unforgiving blue was hazed over with a greasy yellow light. The air grew thick and heavy, and the birds fell silent. Arthur scanned the horizon. He knew the signs. A summer storm was coming, a bad one. The creek that bordered his lower field, now just a trickle, could become a raging torrent in a matter of hours. And in that lower field was his best stand of corn, the crop that represented his only chance of turning a profit this year. A familiar panic seized him. He'd nearly been washed out 2 years ago. He grabbed a shovel and ran toward the creek bed, his mind racing. He needed to build a levee, a temporary wall of rock and packed earth to divert the worst of the floodwater. It was a job for 3 men, and he was only one. He worked with a frantic energy, digging into the hard-packed soil, rolling heavy stones into place. The air was so humid his shirt was soaked with sweat in minutes. His muscles screamed in protest. He was losing. For every foot of wall he built, he knew he needed 10 more. The sky grew darker. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder. He was so focused on his hopeless task that he didn't hear her approach. He only realized she was there when a second shovel bit into the earth beside his. He looked up, startled. Mai stood there, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her face set with determination. She had pulled a kerchief over her hair and moved with a purpose that stunned him. "You should go back to the house," he grunted, heaving another rock into place. "It's not safe." She ignored him. Instead of digging randomly, she walked the length of the creek bed, her eyes scanning the contours of the land. She stopped, pointed to a place 50 feet upstream from where he was working. "Here," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, devoid of any accent he could place. It wasn't the broken English he might have expected. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "The bend is too wide where you are," she explained, her voice cutting through the rising wind. "The water will break through. Here, the bank is higher. The channel is narrow. We build here, we can turn the water." Arthur stared at her, then at the spot she indicated. She was right. He had been fighting the water head-on. She had seen how to guide it. A feeling of profound foolishness washed over him. He nodded, picked up his shovel, and followed her. They worked together, a silent, rhythmic team. She was not strong in the way he was, but she was smarter. She used leverage to move rocks he had struggled with, packing the earth with quick, efficient movements. The wall began to grow, a sturdy, well-engineered barrier. They were making progress. The sound of hoofbeats made them both look up. 3 riders sat on the ridge overlooking the field. It was Bartholomew Thorne, the man who owned the bank, the saloon, and the mortgage on Arthur's land. His 2 hired hands flanked him, their faces smug. Thorne was a large man who dressed in expensive town clothes that looked out of place against the raw landscape. He was the smiling, polite face of every one of Arthur's failures. "Well, Finch," Thorne called down, his voice dripping with condescension. "Fighting with God's own rain again?" A man should know when he's beaten. He let his gaze drift to Mai, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "And I see you found some new help. Can't even get a proper wife to abandon you, so you start importing them." Arthur's hands tightened on his shovel. A hot, helpless anger surged through him. He was about to shout something he'd regret when Mai straightened up. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand and looked directly at Thorne. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "A proper wife builds," she said, her voice carrying easily in the heavy air. "A fool talks." The words landed with the force of a slap. One of Thorne's men coughed to cover a laugh. Thorne's face went from amused condescension to a dark, mottled red. He had been dismissed, publicly, by a small Chinese woman, and his own hired hand had laughed at him. He glared down at them, his eyes filled with a cold promise of retribution. "You'll regret that," he snarled, not at Mai, but at Arthur. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men scrambling to follow. The first drops of rain began to fall as they placed the last rock on the levee. Arthur stood, his body aching, and looked at Mai. The wind whipped strands of hair around her face, and her eyes were fixed on the dark horizon. In that moment, he realized that everything he had assumed about her was wrong. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't helpless. And she certainly wasn't silent. He had brought a stranger to his home, thinking she was the problem he had to solve. He did not yet know that she was the only answer he had, or that the man she had just insulted held the power to destroy them both. That night, the storm broke with a fury that seemed bent on washing the world clean. Rain hammered against the sod roof, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. Inside the dugout, a small fire in the hearth pushed back the damp chill. They sat at the rough table, eating a stew of beans and corn, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with a new, unspoken respect. The sound of the raging creek was a dull roar in the background, a testament to the work they had done. The levee was holding. Arthur cleared his throat. The words felt heavy in his mouth. "Thank you," he said. "I'd have lost everything in that field. I've never seen anyone red the land like that." Mai looked up from her bowl, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Where I grew up, the river was life and death," she said simply. "We learned to guide it, or we drowned. It was an invitation. He took it." "San Francisco?" A shadow passed over her face. "No. Before that. My home was in Guangdong, in the south of China. My father was a farmer. Our farm was all terraces, cut into the side of a mountain, fed by a river." She paused, her gaze distant. "He taught me how water thinks." "What brought you to America?" Arthur asked gently. "The same thing that brings most men like my father," she said, her voice flat. "A promise of gold." First in the mountains, then on the railroad. She looked at her hands, which were clean but chapped from the day's labor. He was a good man. A smart man. He worked for the Central Pacific, laying track through the mountains. It was dangerous work. A blasting accident, he was gone. Arthur felt a pang of sympathy. He knew the stories of the Chinese railroad workers, the ones who did the most dangerous jobs for the least pay. "I'm sorry." "Sorrow doesn't buy passage home," she said, her voice hardening slightly. "I was alone in San Francisco. A woman with no family is prey. The man your money went to, the marriage agent? He is not a good man. He finds girls like me, girls who are trapped, and sells us. He told me you were a rich landowner." She gave a small, humorless smile. "He told you I was a docile, obedient girl from a good family, eager to be a wife." The deception stung, but Arthur understood it. They had both been lied to. "I'm not rich," he said, stating the obvious. "I know," she replied. "But you are not a cruel man. And this land is honest. It doesn't lie about what it is." She rose and went to her small bundle. She carefully untied the twine and unwrapped the cloth. Inside, alongside the tools, was the sealed clay pot he had seen before. She handled it with a reverence that told him it was precious. "My father sent these to me before he died," she said, her voice softening. "Seeds from our village. Plants that know how to live with little water and hot sun. He wanted me to have a piece of home." This was her only inheritance, not money or property, but the future held within a handful of seeds. A comfortable quiet settled between them as the storm raged outside. For the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It felt like hope. The next morning, the world was washed clean and bright. The creek was still swollen, but it had stayed within its banks. The levee had held. The corn was safe. As Arthur walked the property, checking for damage, he saw it, a piece of paper, nailed to his fence post, protected from the rain by a small piece of oilcloth. It was a legal notice from the Redemption Territorial Bank. It was signed by Bartholomew Thorne. Citing a clause in his loan agreement about failure to properly maintain and improve the property, Thorne was calling in the entire debt. Arthur had 30 days to pay the full amount of $200. An impossible sum. It was a foreclosure notice, wrapped in the thin veil of legality. It was Thorne's revenge. The hope from the night before curdled into cold dread. Thorne had him. There was no way to raise that kind of money in a month. He would lose the farm, the land, everything he had worked for. He walked back to the dugout, the notice clutched in his hand. Mai was outside, kneeling in a small patch of earth she had cleared, her precious seeds laid out on a cloth. She looked up as he approached, and she knew from his face that something was wrong. He handed her the paper. She read it slowly, her expression becoming grim. "He is trying to break you," she said. "He's done it," Arthur said, the defeat heavy in his voice. "It's over." He looked away from her, toward the town. An idea, ugly and cowardly, formed in his mind. He could go to Thorne, to the town. He could claim Mai was not what the agent promised, that the contract was fraudulent. He could send her away, cast her out. Maybe, just maybe, they would take pity on him, give him an extension. It would mean sacrificing her to save himself. It would mean throwing her back to the wolves she had just escaped. He looked at her, kneeling in the dirt with her father's seeds, her face calm despite the ruin facing them. She had defended his land. She had shared the truth of her past. She had shown him nothing but strength and honor. And he was considering betraying her. The shame of it was a physical sickness. He made a decision. It was not a decision born of courage or a grand plan. It was a simple, quiet refusal to be the man the town already thought he was. "Pack what you need for a trip to town," he said, his voice rough. "You are sending me away?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No," he said, meeting her eyes. "I'm not." He hitched the wagon, and they rode into Redemption. He didn't stop at the bank or the saloon. He stopped at the small territorial clerk's office. He walked inside, my silent presence behind him, and stepped up to the counter. "I'm here to file the paperwork on my marriage," he told the clerk, his voice steady. He was officially binding himself to this woman, this stranger. He was choosing to stand with her, making her fight his fight. It was financial suicide. It was the only choice he could live with. He was giving up his last, desperate chance to save his farm by appealing to the town's pity. In their eyes, he was doubling down on his foolishness. But as he signed his name on the document, he felt the crack inside him begin to heal. For months later, the relentless heat of summer had softened into the golden light of early autumn. The air was crisp in the mornings, and the prairie grass had faded to a pale yellow. But on Arthur Finch's homestead, there was more green than ever. The corn, saved by the levee, had grown tall and full. The harvest had been better than Arthur had dared to hope, and the price of corn was high. He had sold every bushel, and for the first time in 5 years, he had a substantial amount of cash locked in a box under his bed. But the real transformation was in the garden Mai had planted. The seeds from the small clay pot had sprouted into sprawling vines and hardy bushes he didn't recognize. They produced strange, knobby gourds, deep purple beans, and a type of leafy green that grew with astonishing speed in the dry soil. At first, the townsfolk were suspicious of the foreign vegetables. But Mai, with quiet persistence, had cooked a small batch of stir-fried greens and offered a sample to the storekeeper's wife. The woman was amazed by the flavor. Word spread. Soon, the women of Redemption were coming to the farm, not to gossip about Arthur's strange wife, but to buy her vegetables and ask for advice on their own struggling gardens. They had a new, steady source of income. Mai's knowledge of water had reshaped the farm itself. Together, they had spent weeks digging a series of narrow, shallow channels leading from the creek, creating a simple but effective irrigation system that brought life to the thirsty land. The homestead no longer looked like a scar on the prairie. It looked like a place where things could grow. On the last day of the 30-day notice, Bartholomew Thorne arrived on his fine horse, a sheaf of legal papers in his hand and a triumphant smirk on his face. He was not flanked by his men this time, he had come to savor his victory alone. Arthur met him on the small porch of the dugout. He wasn't stooped with defeat. He stood straight, his hands clean, his shirt mended. "Finch," Thorne began, his voice oozing false sympathy. "The day has come. I'm sorry it had to end this way." Arthur said nothing. He simply held out a piece of paper. It was a bank draft from the Freighter's Bank in Cheyenne, the one place Thorne didn't control. It was for the full $200, plus interest. Thorne's smirk vanished. He snatched the draft, his eye scanning it for some flaw. There was none. The paper was good. He had been beaten. Legally, financially, and publicly. A few wagons had stopped on the road, the occupants watching the scene with open curiosity. "This changes nothing," Thorne hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You're still a fool with a foreign bride on a worthless piece of rock." "The land is not worthless," Arthur said calmly. "And she is my wife." Thorne crumpled the foreclosure notice in his fist. He stared at Arthur, then at Mai, who stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. He had lost, and he had lost in front of an audience. Without another word, he mounted his horse and galloped away, leaving only a cloud of dust and his own bitter humiliation behind him. The people on the road watched him go, and then they looked at Arthur and his wife, their expressions no longer filled with pity or scorn, but with a new, grudging respect. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose, Arthur and Mai sat on the porch. The air was cool and quiet. He reached up and took the cracked blue and white plate from its hook beside the door. For years, it had been a symbol of his failure, a reminder of a genteel life he could never provide. He held it in his hands, turning it over. Mai reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers gently covering the crack in the porcelain. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and then out at their land, the irrigated fields, the thriving garden, the solid little house. He had spent so many years trying to find a woman who would fit into the life he thought he was supposed to have. He never imagined the right person would be the one who helped him build a life he never knew he wanted. The land didn't need a bride who knew how to serve tea on a porcelain plate. It needed a partner who knew the language of water and seeds. And so did he. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.